In the shadow of towering cathedrals and candlelit chambers, beneath the pious chants of monks and the strict gaze of priests, a different world thrived in secret. The medieval era was a time of contradictions, an age where faith ruled every corner of life, and yet lust, desire, and forbidden pleasures pulsed in the shadows. Behind the veils of morality, people whispered of bizarre rituals, shameful practices, and punishments so grotesque they blurred the line between devotion and perversion. Sex in the Middle Ages was never simply about pleasure. It was wrapped in fear of sin, of hellfire, of demons said to lurk in the bedroom. And yet, it was also the source of fascination, obsession, and experimentation. From strange rules imposed by the church to dark love potions brewed in secrecy, the sexual world of medieval men and women was stranger than most dare to imagine. Tonight, we peel back the veil. This is not the romance of knights and maidens. This is the other side of the Middle Ages, the most bizarre sexual practices of a world both devout and depraved. If there was one power that controlled the very act of intimacy in the Middle Ages, it was the church. It did not simply guide prayer and worship, it dictated when, how, and even why a man and woman were allowed to lie together. To medieval Christians, sex was not about love or pleasure. It was about duty, reproduction, and the eternal salvation of the soul. The church fathers developed what they called confession manuals, grim little books that priests used when hearing confessions. These books listed, in chilling detail, the sins of the flesh. Every position, every thought, every forbidden act was catalogued, condemned, and given a corresponding punishment. It wasn't just adultery or fornication that sent souls to hell. Something as simple as having sex on a Sunday or during a holy feast was branded as mortal sin. Couples could be damned for sleeping together on Good Friday, for touching one another in Lent, or even for enjoying themselves too much. And then came the rules of how sex should occur. Missionary position was considered the only holy way, and even then it was to be done quickly, silently, and without pleasure. The idea of lust between a husband and wife was considered just as sinful as lusting after another man's spouse. Pleasure was always suspect, a dangerous spark of the devil hiding beneath the sheets. But the church went further, weaving sex into the supernatural fears of the age. It was believed that demons prowled in bedrooms at night. Succubi and incubi, malevolent spirits, were thought to seduce men and women in their sleep, draining their life force through forbidden acts. A man who awoke from a lustful dream was not simply dreaming. He was believed to have been visited by a demon. To touch one's body, to feel desire, was to invite darkness. Imagine the paranoia. To want one's own wife was a sin. To resist her too much was cruelty. To dream of another was evidence of demonic attack. A man or woman's soul was balanced on a razor's edge. Their most private moments turned into a battlefield between heaven and hell. Even bathing together was forbidden. Medieval manuals describe husbands and wives being warned against entering the bath naked, lest temptation overcome them. A bath, after all, was not just a place of cleanliness. It was a place where the body could be seen, admired, desired. The church taught that the devil crept in through such moments of weakness. But the most bizarre of all were the endless lists of days when sex was banned. In some places, nearly half the year was off limits. Advent, Lent, Easter, feast days, fast days, Sundays, Fridays. There were so many prohibitions that couples often found themselves wondering if any days remained when marital intimacy was even allowed. To disobey was to risk not just social shame, but eternal damnation. And yet, despite this suffocating web of rules, human desire refused to be silenced. People confessed, begged forgiveness, and then did it again. Behind closed doors, men and women laughed at the absurdity, bent the rules, or sought stranger ways to fulfill their desires. For every law the church imposed, a darker, more secret practice took root in its shadow. It was the perfect recipe for obsession, for a society where lust was treated as poison and yet whispered about more than anything else. Because the truth was undeniable. The more the church tried to control desire, the stranger and more elaborate the sexual world of the Middle Ages became. In an age where lust was considered both sinful and dangerous, people turned to a different source of power: potions, charms, and spells that promised to control desire. Some sought to inflame it, others to suppress it. In both cases, the remedies were as bizarre as they were unsettling. To the medieval mind, passion was not simply a human feeling. It was a force, something that could be brewed, bottled, or cursed into existence. And so love potions became a shadowy market, whispered about in villages, sold in secret, and feared by the church as one step away from witchcraft. These concoctions were rarely romantic. Instead, they were grotesque mixtures of blood, animal parts, and sometimes even the dead. A woman desperate for her husband's fidelity might slip him a drink laced with crushed herbs or worse, a few drops of her own menstrual blood hidden in wine. The belief was that blood bound a man to a woman's body, tying his desire to her like a spell. Other recipes called for stranger ingredients: powdered bones stolen from graveyards, ashes of human hair, or milk from nursing mothers. In some regions, it was whispered that if a woman baked bread with a pinch of her bodily fluids inside, no man could resist her. The church, of course, condemned such practices as devilry, but that did not stop the desperate from seeking them out. The darker side of these potions was not about attraction, but control. A jealous wife might slip her husband a mixture designed to sap his strength, to make him less virile, less capable of straying. One chilling remedy recorded in medical texts involved grinding the dried genitals of animals into powder and feeding them to an unfaithful lover to dampen his lust. And then there were the aphrodisiacs, consumed not out of love, but raw hunger for pleasure. Medieval texts describe oysters, fennel, and honey as simple stimulants. But alongside these came remedies that bordered on madness. The brains of sparrows, thought to be lustful creatures, were dried and eaten. The testicles of goats were boiled into stews. Even ground beetles and salamanders were said to ignite fiery passion if swallowed at the right moment. But perhaps the most infamous of all was the mandrake root. Shaped eerily like a human body, the mandrake was believed to scream when pulled from the earth, killing anyone who heard its cry. Despite its dangers, it was prized as a love charm. A man might keep a mandrake hidden under his bed, believing it would inflame his partner's desire. A woman might steep it in wine, whispering incantations to ensure fidelity. But the line between potion and poison was perilously thin. Some lovers ended their nights not in ecstasy, but in convulsions and death. What made these potions even more terrifying was how closely they resembled witchcraft. To the church, a woman who brewed herbs in secret was no different from a sorceress. Many of the ingredients, blood, bones, hair, were the very symbols of black magic. If discovered, such women could be accused of consorting with the devil. Yet the demand never vanished. For every priest who thundered against love charms, there were villagers quietly seeking them in the dead of night. Sometimes the potions were not even meant for lovers at all. They were meant for rivals. One chilling recipe tells of baking a cake with graveyard dirt, then feeding it to an enemy to destroy his sexual power forever. Medieval men feared nothing more than impotence. And to be cursed with it was not just humiliation, but a kind of living death. Even physicians, those rare men of learning, were not free from these beliefs. Medical texts of the Middle Ages are filled with recipes for stimulating desire. Some involve boiling wine with exotic spices from the East. Others recommend the fat of snakes or the blood of doves. Learned men cloaked these in the language of medicine, but in truth, they were no less superstitious than the charms sold by village women. And all of this reveals something profound about medieval sexuality. It was never seen as natural, never seen as something people simply felt. Instead, it was feared as a force to be controlled, manipulated, or stolen. Love was not just a matter of the heart. It was alchemy, it was sorcery, it was a dangerous obsession. Imagine the paranoia of that world. A husband takes a sip of wine and wonders, was this sweet taste hiding a drop of blood? A woman eats bread and asks herself, is this bread binding me to someone I do not love? Every meal, every drink, every herb carried with it the whisper of enchantment. For the medieval mind, love itself was poison, and so they tried to bottle it. The Middle Ages were a world where desire was not only sinful but dangerous. If discovered, your most private acts could be dragged into the light of the public square and punished in ways designed not just to wound the flesh, but to humiliate the soul. For the medieval world, sex was never just personal, it was political, religious, and moral. To commit a sin of the flesh was not simply to betray a lover, it was to betray God, the community, and the order of the universe itself. And punishment came swiftly, often wrapped in rituals of public shame. Adultery was among the most despised of crimes, though, curiously, it was punished more harshly for women than for men. A wife caught in infidelity could expect brutal humiliation. Some towns forced the guilty to march through the streets barefoot, half naked, carrying symbols of their shame. In parts of Germany, women were paraded on donkeys, facing backward, while the townsfolk jeered and hurled filth. In England, a wife convicted of adultery might be made to wear a symbolic hood with horns attached, branding her forever as unfaithful. Horns, after all, were the sign of the cuckold, the shame a husband bore when his wife strayed. But the burden always seemed to fall heavier on the woman. While her punishment was public, the man she sinned with often escaped with little more than a fine. But not all adulterers escaped so lightly. Records tell of couples being bound together in chains and forced to stand before the church until forgiven. In harsher regions, lovers caught in the act were beaten, branded, or even mutilated, their noses or ears cut away as a mark of their sin. When people today imagine medieval sexual control, one image always appears: the chastity belt. A cruel device of iron, locked around a woman's waist, preventing all intimacy until her husband returned. But was it real? Historians now debate. Many of the belts displayed in museums were likely created centuries later, more as fantasies than genuine tools. And yet, the very fact that people believed they were real tells us something. The idea that a husband could lock his wife's body like a chest of treasure, and that her virtue could be preserved with cold iron, haunted the medieval imagination. Whether fact or myth, the chastity belt became the symbol of a society where sexuality was treated as property and where control was more important than trust. For those accused of deviant acts, homosexuality, bestiality, or even excessive lust, punishments turned darker still. Homosexuality was considered not only a sin, but a crime against nature. In some regions, men caught with other men were castrated, burned, or drowned. The church taught that such acts called down divine wrath on entire communities. The punishment was not only vengeance but purification by fire and blood. Bestiality carried equal terror. In France, a man accused of such an act was not executed alone. The animal was executed with him. There are records of goats, cows, and horses being led into the square, judged as partners in sin, and burned or hanged beside the man who touched them. It was as if the medieval mind could not comprehend sin without spectacle, without turning punishment into a theater of horror. And for women accused of lust or witchcraft, there were devices designed specifically to torment. The scold's bridle, an iron mask that locked over the head, with a sharp tongue piece pressing down into the mouth, silenced women accused of gossip, nagging, or promiscuity. Once locked in, they were paraded through the town, a living warning to others. The strangest thing about medieval punishments was how often they relied not on death, but on shame. A man caught in lechery might be forced to run naked through the streets, whipped as the crowd laughed. A woman might be plunged into a river again and again, cleansed of her sins through near drowning. The punishments were designed to make sexuality grotesque, to turn pleasure into humiliation, love into suffering. To be accused was to lose not only your freedom, but your dignity. And yet, the irony is haunting. These punishments, meant to destroy lust, often revealed society's obsession with it. Why else craft devices shaped for the tongue, for the genitals, for the very organs of desire? Why else parade the guilty half-naked, unless some dark fascination lingered behind the moral outrage? Some punishments, however, went beyond shame. In Italy and Germany, adulterous women could be buried alive. In England, men accused of rape were sometimes castrated before being hanged. The law books are filled with chilling details: flesh torn with hot irons, bodies broken on the wheel, even execution by fire for those who defied God's natural law. For medieval people, sexuality was more than private sin. It was a force that threatened the order of the world, and to control it, they turned to the most brutal punishments imaginable. Desire was hunted, beaten, silenced, and displayed. But no matter how severe the punishment, no matter how grotesque the spectacle, lust never died. It lived on, in whispers, in shadows, in secret rituals waiting to be discovered. For all the fear and punishment surrounding lust, the medieval world still bowed to one undeniable truth: without sex, there was no future. Fertility, the ability to bear children, was the great obsession of the age. In a world of high infant mortality, plagues, and constant wars, the continuation of a family's bloodline was everything. And so, fertility was pursued with rituals, charms, and practices so bizarre they reveal just how desperate people were to coax life into the womb. The church had condemned lust, but it also blessed fertility. Couples who struggled to conceive often turned to relics of saints, bones, scraps of clothing, even drops of blood, believed to carry holy power. In some regions, women were instructed to sleep with a saint's relic beneath their pillow, as if the sacred would mingle with their dreams and awaken the womb. In France, women desperate for children flocked to the shrine of Saint Guinefort, a saint who, disturbingly, was no man at all, but a greyhound dog venerated as holy. Mothers left offerings, then lay in the grass around his shrine, believing the spirit of the dog saint could bless them with milk and fertility. To modern minds it seems absurd, but for medieval families, the line between holiness and superstition was paper thin. Animals were often drawn into the rituals of fertility. To drink the milk of a pregnant mare, some believed, would grant a woman the ability to conceive. Others swore by burying an egg beneath the marital bed, so that the mysterious power of life contained within the shell would pass into the wife. Some practices grew darker. Records from rural Europe tell of couples sleeping on the hide of a freshly slaughtered animal, hoping the raw vitality of the beast's blood would soak into their bodies. The symbolism was clear: life stolen from death, fertility born from sacrifice. Medieval medicine, equal parts science and superstition, was filled with strange recipes to spark conception. Women were told to drink mixtures of honey and nettles, or wine boiled with herbs that symbolized virility, like fennel or parsley. But other remedies sound closer to sorcery than medicine. Some potions required powdered stag antlers, boiled in wine, to transfer the animal's strength to a man. Others advised women to secretly consume mixtures of rabbit wombs, believing the fertility of the animal would pass into them. And in the darkest corners of folk practice, there are whispers of brews made from human ashes, even ground bones taken from graveyards, swallowed in secret to awaken barren wombs. Not all practices required potions. Some involved rituals within the marriage bed itself. A common superstition held that a woman who rolled over immediately after intercourse risked losing the seed, and so wives were instructed to lie still, legs raised, to help conception. Other customs were stranger still. In parts of Eastern Europe, couples were told to make love beneath fruit trees, believing the fertility of the orchard would pass into them. In Italy, women wore amulets shaped like phalluses, not considered obscene, but sacred charms to ward off infertility. And in some regions, couples who could not conceive were encouraged to copulate in the fields, where the earth itself might join in blessing them. Behind all these practices was something far darker: the burden of blame. In almost every case, infertility was laid at the feet of the woman. A barren wife was not simply unfortunate, she was cursed, suspicious, sometimes even accused of witchcraft. If a husband could not produce heirs, it was whispered that his wife had closed her womb with magic, or that demons had cursed their union. This fear drove women into dangerous practices. Some sought midwives who doubled as witches, offering charms of blood and bone. Others risked their health with strange brews of poisonous herbs. In some cases, women even submitted themselves to rituals of humiliation, crawling naked through churchyards or fasting until collapse, all in the hope of carrying life. What is most haunting about medieval fertility rituals is how often they blurred the boundary between life and death. Graveyard dust, bones, animal blood, relics of saints, these were all seen as channels of power. To the medieval mind, fertility was not simply about nature, it was about bargaining with forces beyond human control, with saints, with spirits, with the strange and the sacred. Every act of intimacy carried with it the weight of survival. Every barren womb was a curse. And so the medieval world twisted love into ritual, desire into superstition. Because in the Middle Ages, to fail at fertility was not simply to disappoint a husband. It was to risk the extinction of a bloodline, the ultimate fear in a world obsessed with legacy. If the church tried to bury lust under rules and punishments, there were moments in the medieval calendar when all of those chains were broken. Festivals, carnivals, and brothels created spaces where the forbidden was not only tolerated, but celebrated. For a brief, dangerous time, sin itself became spectacle. Every winter, in cathedrals across Europe, priests themselves played at blasphemy during the so-called Feast of Fools. Choir boys dressed as bishops, priests paraded donkeys through the church, and bawdy songs replaced sacred chants. But what began in the nave often spilled into the streets. Masks and disguises gave cover to desire. Men dressed as women, women dressed as men. Villagers mocked the clergy, sang obscene songs, and performed mock marriages in public. Drinking, feasting, and unrestrained sexuality turned cities upside down. The church condemned the festival, but again and again it returned, because people craved the release. For one night, the rules of God were mocked, and sin was transformed into play. The medieval carnival was more than drunken revelry. It was an eruption of what society repressed. Towns erupted into parades where obscene symbols were carried openly, giant wooden phalluses, obscene songs, dances that mimicked sex in exaggerated pantomime. In Italy, men and women hurled oranges at one another in a symbolic battle of fertility. In France, masked dancers performed mock copulations in the streets. And across Europe, carnival was linked to the season of Lent, a last desperate indulgence before 40 days of fasting and denial. It was during these carnivals that lines blurred most dangerously. Nobles mingled with peasants, men with women, priests with townsfolk. The masks made everyone equal, and in that anonymity, lust burned freely. Rumors tell of orgiastic gatherings hidden in barns and taverns, where strangers paired in drunken abandon, justified by the excuse, "It is carnival. All sins are forgiven." Beyond festivals, there were places where sin lived permanently, the brothels. Every major medieval city had them. And the most shocking part? They were not illegal. In fact, many were run under the protection of the city council, or even the local bishop. The church taught that prostitutes were a necessary evil, better that men visit them than corrupt, honorable women. And so brothels became institutionalized, with taxes collected from the very sin priests preached against. Inside these houses, however, lurked both pleasure and danger. Brothels were often hotbeds of disease. Syphilis, gonorrhea, and other illnesses spread like wildfire. Yet men still came, desperate to sate the desires they were forbidden to indulge at home. Women working there sometimes used their own charms, love potions, herbs, or amulets, to keep clients returning. And brothels were not always hidden. In some cities, they stood openly on main streets, marked with red lanterns or paintings of erotic scenes. Passers-by knew exactly what lay behind those doors. Not all carnivals came from Christian tradition. Many were remnants of older pagan rites of fertility. May Day, for instance, was a celebration where villagers erected the maypole, a towering, unmistakably phallic symbol, and danced around it, singing fertility songs. Couples sometimes vanished into the woods, returning only at dawn. The church tried to Christianize the holiday, but the pagan shadows lingered. In parts of Eastern Europe, harvest festivals ended with rituals that today sound like thinly veiled orgies. Men and women would gather in barns, drink until collapse, and lie together in heaps of straw, convinced that their union would bless the fields with abundance. The blending of old and new made these festivals both dangerous and irresistible. They were moments when medieval men and women could slip the grip of priests and touch something more primal. something wilder than doctrine allowed. The carnivals of the medieval era were more than holidays. They were a release valve for a repressed society. For most of the year, men and women were told their bodies were sinful, their desires demonic. But for a few nights each year, those same desires were unleashed in fire, music, and laughter. And yet, there was always a shadow. Priests warned that demons lurked in the masks of carnival, that witches slipped into the crowds spreading lust and poison. Some blamed outbreaks of plague on carnival sin, claiming God's wrath had been provoked by these shameless displays. But still, the festivals returned year after year. Because no matter how brutal the punishments, no matter how heavy the rules, people needed release. The carnival was the one time they could laugh at God, mock the priests, and give themselves to pleasure without shame. Carnivals of sin were the mirror image of medieval piety. The same society that built cathedrals also built festivals of lust. The same hands that held rosaries also raised goblets of wine. The same lips that prayed to saints also sang obscene songs in the night. It was proof of the deepest medieval truth. Repression does not kill desire. It only makes it burn brighter, waiting for the mask, the festival, the brothel, the moment when sin becomes spectacle. For every carnival, every drunken festival of lust, there was an opposite force in the medieval world, the cult of purity. To resist desire, to conquer the body, was considered a mark of holiness. Virginity was not only admired, it was worshipped. And from that worship grew some of the most bizarre and terrifying practices of all. The Church exalted virginity above all other states. To remain pure was to mirror the Virgin Mary herself. Saints who resisted temptation became legendary. Stories tell of young women pursued by lustful men who cut off their own hair, mutilated their faces, or even leapt to their deaths rather than give up their virginity. Some martyrs were said to bleed fire when touched, or to emit the stench of decay that frightened attackers away. Miracles meant to show that God protected chastity with supernatural power. In truth, these tales became propaganda, teaching women that their bodies were never truly their own, but symbols of holiness or sin. Desire was often explained not as a natural human drive, but as possession. A woman who longed for a man might be said to harbor a succubus within her. A man who could not stop his urges might be thought bewitched by a witch's spell. And the solution? Exorcism. Records describe priests performing rituals over men and women consumed by lust. Holy water was sprinkled, prayers were chanted, and sometimes physical beatings were given to drive the demon out. Imagine the terror of a man who simply wanted a lover, dragged before the altar, whipped and humiliated in the name of God. The medieval physician, caught between superstition and science, also played his part. Medicine of the era often prescribed shocking treatments for lust. For men considered too lustful, doctors suggested bloodletting, draining the body until weakness dulled desire. For women, remedies included fumigation with burning herbs applied beneath the skirts, meant to cool the womb. Some were told to press burning hot irons near their thighs to drive out excess heat. Even stranger were the treatments for women accused of hysteria, thought to be caused by an unsatisfied womb. Physicians recommended strange massages, fumigations, or in some cases, insertion of bizarre tools. Behind the veil of medicine, desire was treated like a sickness to be purged. The cult of virginity also bred a culture of suspicion. Women were often forced to prove their purity through invasive tests. Midwives were sometimes called to examine brides on their wedding night. The blood-stained sheets of the marriage bed were displayed publicly as proof of virtue. If the sheets remained clean, suspicion, and sometimes punishment, followed. This obsession could be deadly. Accusations of false virginity sometimes led to charges of witchcraft or worse, infidelity. In the eyes of medieval society, a woman who was not pure was dangerous, her desire a threat to order. The medieval world both worshipped and feared desire. Virginity was praised, but women who resisted marriage too long could be accused of selfishness or witchcraft. Men were told to control their lust, but mocked if they failed to produce heirs. Priests condemned sexuality, yet their confession manuals recorded every detail of it with disturbing fascination. The result was a society trapped in contradiction, a world where the body was both sacred and cursed, where every act of intimacy carried the weight of heaven and hell. And perhaps that is why medieval practices grew so strange. Because when something as natural as desire is treated as demonic, people turn to desperate measures, potions, punishments, tortures, and rituals. Love becomes fear, lust becomes disease, pleasure becomes a battlefield. The medieval world was a place where desire was never simple. It was chained by the church, distorted by superstition, and punished by law. What should have been natural became a battleground of fear, guilt, and control. Behind castle walls, and within the shadows of cathedrals, men and women lived lives torn between flesh and faith. Their most private acts were judged by priests, dictated by manuals, and whispered about in confessions. A kiss could be a sin. A touch could summon the devil. A night of passion could demand public proof on blood-stained sheets. And so, strange customs were born. Love potions brewed from blood, tortures designed to cure desire, festivals that turned into carnivals of sin. Virginity raised to the level of sainthood, while lust was branded as demonic possession. Looking back, these practices reveal more than just the darkness of the medieval mind. They show us the cost of repression. When the natural is silenced, the unnatural takes its place. When pleasure is feared, it festers into rituals of pain. The medieval era may be gone, but its shadows still whisper. Desire can never truly be chained. No matter how many rules, rituals, or punishments, the human heart and body will always find a way to rebel. So remember, in the Middle Ages, the most intimate act was never truly private. It was a spectacle, a sin, and sometimes a sentence.